Warlick. Ms. Warlick, a former U.S. ambassador to Serbia and senior Foreign Service officer, retired from the Department of State in September 2017 following a diplomatic career of over 34 years. She served in a variety of senior leadership positions in Washington and overseas, including the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary and Acting Special Envoy and Coordinator for International Energy Affairs, U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Serbia, and Principal Officer and U.S. Consul General in Melbourne, Australia. Ambassador Warlick, thank you so much for joining us today. And finally, we have Ozgur Unluhisarcikli, and he's the director of the German Marshall Fund's office in Ankara. Prior to joining GMF, he was the manager of the Resource Development Department of the Educational Volunteers Foundation of Turkey. Previously, he worked as the director of the ARI movement, a Turkish NGO democratic promoting participatory democracy, and as a consultant at AB Consulting and Investment Services. After graduating from Robert College, he received his bachelor's degree in business administration from Marmara University and his master's from Koç University. So to our audience members, you can see why our panelist is just so dynamic. So we're thrilled to be able to turn the floor over to them. Just one more note before we start this conversation today. We are going to do our best to fit in as much as we can in this conversation. Obviously, it is very nuanced and detailed, and we want to make sure we start with the overall themes, but also I want to encourage you all to include some questions in the audience Q&A that I will be checking throughout this entire conversation. So please be sure to put any comments or questions in the audience Q&A so that we can leave time for some questions at the end from you all. So with that, I want to kick it off. Mark, Kimmitt, I'm going to turn the floor over to you. Today, we're talking about the future of transatlantic relations. So obviously, there are some major changes happening with a new incoming administration. So what are some immediate changes or approaches specifically in terms of NATO or the transatlantic relations that we may see from the incoming administration?
Yeah, well, I think it's pretty obvious to everybody that the number one thing that we'll see out of this administration, probably the most needed thing, is sort of rebuild the sense of where America fits in the alliance. As so many people have said, this notion of America alone was unhelpful to the conversation because to many in particularly this organization, America alone was seen as America adrift, pulling itself away from the transatlantic alliance. And I think all of us on this group would recognize how important it is. But I think the second thing, and which could be a mistake on the part of the Biden administration, is to somehow think that they can just switch the light back on and everything will be the way it was when President Obama left office. And that's simply not the case. There have been many, but not necessarily tectonic changes within the alliance since the election of President Trump. There's still questions about funding. There's still questions about mission. There's still questions about the same challenges we had after '89 and before '96, when we went into Bosnia. This notion of, for NATO in particular, are we at the point now where we've got to go further out of area or go out of business? So I think those are probably the three most pressing issues that need to be addressed by the Biden administration. And I would hope that we have people, while we're waiting for the principles to be confirmed, we have good people at the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State positions, kind of the quality that we had when Mary Warlick was in the job. So if we can get those people in place quickly, I think that we can get this mission to rebuild the relationship off in a pretty rapid pace.
Thank you. And certainly I'm excited to hear from the ambassador, but I think, you hit that point, and is that the revitalization of NATO is critical. And I think that's really the future, but also there are going to be changes naturally that we see and how to address that moving forward. Now, Ambassador, I want to turn to you and kind of focus specifically on the Eurasian theater. How might this new administration change? Will there be increased focus or less detachment in the region, or we're going to see any changes in policy as it relates to this specific region?
Great. Well, thank you, Savannah. I think the first point I would like to make, and maybe it's an obvious one, but it's worth underscoring, is that President-elect Biden and his national security team are going to bring, very extensive and deep foreign policy experience to their new roles, and considerable previous engagement in the region, Eurasia region writ large. President-elect Biden himself, of course, but his Secretary of State nominee Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan as National Security Advisor all have considerable experience in working on not just a whole wide range of global foreign policy issues, but very specifically in Eurasia. I would anticipate very careful and close attention to developments in the region, and consistent support for sovereign, democratic, and economically prosperous countries with a real commitment to building upon US and EU relationships and ties. I would anticipate, and this is something they've made quite clear across the board, close cooperation with our transatlantic partners and with other allies in policy approaches and assistance programs in the region. And I'll just say a couple of quick words on two countries, because there's just Eurasia encompasses such a broad scope, obviously. But in Ukraine, I think it's very clear the US has a strong interest in supporting Ukraine as a stable, independent, and democratic state with a strong market economy, and good, strong relations with the US, as I mentioned, is very much in the US interest. As we know, Ukrainians voted for change with the election of President Zelensky in 2019 and for reform. And Ukrainians themselves want to restore Ukraine's sovereignty, stand up to Russia, align with the Euro-Atlantic community, and tackle the oligarchic system that feeds corruption. So, there are a number of things, obviously, that the new administration may want to look at. And one, as I said, is strengthening transatlantic unity and approaches to Ukraine. The question of whether the the new administration might take another look at naming a new special envoy is something, obviously, that they'd be up to them to take a look at. But building strong, strong transatlantic relationship, as well as rebuilding bipartisan support for Ukraine policy, which has been eroded by impeachment process and all that we observed there. And the strong support in Capitol Hill and Congress is also going to be important for maintaining support for economic and military assistance to Ukraine, which is so needed. I would too anticipate, as was the case when President-elect Biden was vice president, that there would be very tough and straightforward discussions with Ukraine and other countries in the region on the need for necessary reforms, tackling corruption, as I mentioned, and all of these are so important for strengthening the country's democracies and economies, and of course important for IMF and other programs. And then last but not least, of course, engaging very intensively on ongoing negotiations with regard to Russia's withdrawal from the Donbass and Crimea, and having some frank discussions and real engagement with Russia on that issue. And on Belarus, I'd just like to say, touch briefly, because this is an issue since the August 9 presidential election, where Vice President-elect Biden has actually spoken out twice, issued two clear statements on Belarus. The first was on August 10th, the day after the presidential election, and again on October 27. He made very clear his support for the release of political prisoners, respect for the rights of peaceful protesters, support for democratic principles and human rights, and his plans to work with European and partners and allies to lay out a plan of economic support for truly sovereign and democratic Belarus. So I think those are all very clear signals of, the president-elect's intention to focus and engage in the region, to work closely with European partners. And in many respects, as I said, I think it will apply, that approach will apply to, our engagement, the new administration's engagement with countries across the region.
Certainly. Thank you, Ambassador. Now, Ozgur, I want to turn to you, because obviously a critical component of this transatlantic relationship is, of course, the US-Turkey bilateral relationship. And it's no question that this relationship has been tense, but we've also seen a unique relationship between President Trump and President Erdogan. So what does this election of President-elect Joe Biden mean for not only the US-Turkey relationship, but Turkey's position within NATO as well?
Thank you very much, Savannah. As a matter of fact, even during the Trump administration, the Turkish-US relationship was in crisis mode more often than not, and we could discuss the reasons. As a matter of fact, let me briefly discuss why. Now, I actually focus on the core reasons rather than the different crises per se. I think that there are three core problems between Turkey and the United States. The first problem is that we have an outdated strategic framework of the relationship that was devised during the Cold War and is no longer relevant or is no longer guiding our path when it comes to the current situation. Second, there is an erosion of trust, or I could actually say there is now very strong mutual suspicions between Turkey and the United States. Some of them are structural, like if I want to mention, for example, most of Turkish society believes that the United States has a plan to create a Kurdish state on Turkey's borders, which in time would claim Turkish territory. On the other hand, not everything is structural. For example, President Erdogan and people around him also suspect that the United States has a plan to remove him from office. So this is more personal rather than structural. And of course, Americans also have their own suspicions about Turkey. The third problem is that actually the strategic community of US-Turkey relationship has collapsed. The ownership is no longer there, not in Washington, not in Ankara. Part of the problem is because in the good old days, the owners of the relationship were the respective militaries on both sides. But on the Turkish side, not only has the face of the Turkish military changed, the Turkish military is actually no longer a decision-making actor in Turkey. Well, I mean, in the United States, another thing has happened. The gravity within the Pentagon has shifted away from EUCOM to CENTCOM, which necessarily is not a bad thing normally, but the EUCOM officers know Turkey well. They have Turkish friends that they have worked together, whereas you don't see the same situation in CENTCOM. And for this reason also, there is a different outlook for Turkey in the Pentagon as well. So these are structural issues that were relevant during the Trump era, that will be relevant in the Biden era, and which I'm afraid may be relevant beyond as well. But the transition also means a lot for the following reasons. First of all, president-to-president relationship. Trump and Erdogan were kindred spirits. They liked each other. For one reason or another, they genuinely liked each other. There is an opposite situation between Biden and Erdogan. Biden has publicly manifested his dislike of Erdogan. Erdogan was not that open, but also with his support to Trump until even after the election was over, also shows that Erdogan is not fond of Biden either. I mean, this is one problem. Second problem is actually about the likely nature of Biden's team. Turkey has been scapegoating the Obama administration for 4 years. And now some of those people who have been scapegoated during the last 4 years are coming back to the administration. And they will take decisions that are consequential for Turkey. But there's actually another element. So the Biden administration is likely to be institutional rather than personal. This creates a set of problems. First of all, Turkey is used to dealing with the top person. We got used to this during the last couple of years. This will not be the case. The Biden administration will be institutional. Given his age, Biden, I think, will leave policymaking to his secretaries. And if we take the case of Antony Blinken, he has risen through the ranks of the State Department. So he's likely to support the institutional nature of the State Department, which means that Turkey will need to deal with officials at various levels, which I'm not sure Ankara is ready to do. Now, another problem will be in the area of policy. Well, Biden himself has strong feelings about the Eastern Mediterranean. He was one of the senators who signed the arms embargo to Turkey. His, pro-Greek leaning is well known. And although maybe he's a little bit more balanced, and Antony Blinken also has a similar approach. So I believe that the Eastern Mediterranean problem and the Cyprus problem will become a little bit more difficult for Turkey under the presidency of Biden. But all is not bad news. I mean, for example, the Biden presidency will be critical of Turkey on grounds of democracy and human rights, but then so will the Biden administration be critical of Egypt, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, even Israel on similar grounds. And these countries are Turkey's regional competitors or adversaries, depending on the way you want to define it. So, this is both a negative and a positive for Turkey. But the last thing I would like to say is, having said all of this, President Biden will probably be very different from Vice President Biden or candidate Biden or Senator Biden. Presidents come to office to solve problems, not to agitate them. So he would probably try to solve the problems with Turkey first, rather than agitating the situation. And this gives Turkey an opportunity to actually start a positive spiral. But the problem there is, very early on in Biden's presidency, Turkey and the United States may need to face off regarding the S-400s, which is not easy for Turkey to resolve either. Let me stop here.
Thank you, Ozgur. Now, Mark, we had discussed that you have to pause your camera in a moment, so I want to just jump to you really quickly before you need to step away for a moment during this panel. There is obviously a lot that we have already covered, so feel free if you want to make a comment. But as Ozgur mentioned, many of the principles within the Obama administration are here once again. So when we're speaking specifically about the Middle East region, the MENA region, there are so many different hot points, whether it be a continuation, unfortunately, of the Syrian crisis, developments in Libya, as we've heard, Eastern Mediterranean, etc. Where might the strategy focus coming from a Biden administration? And are we going to see sort of an Obama 2.0 when it comes to addressing the issues in the Middle East?
I think the most pressing issue, of course, and I'll speak simply on that one point, is that of Iran. There's great concern in the region, particularly among our Arab allies and Israel, which candidly may be one of the reasons they're coming together, is the expressed desire of this administration to get back, the next administration, to get back into the JCPOA. Now, even though they are very clear that they want to negotiate very much as President Trump did, which is on the issues not only of their nuclear program, but that of missiles and malign activities in the region, I think Zarif and Rouhani will limit any return to the JCPOA as a binary choice. Either you take it as it is, or you don't come back in. We're not going to negotiate on these other points. But I also think the subset of that is, as so many people do, we can't think of Iran simply as Iran. There are various elements, the conservatives, the importance of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, and the moderates, and they're all coming up for election this year. So I think that the most complicating issue in the Middle East will be that of Iran, not only trying to re-enter the JCPOA on our terms opposed to their terms, but also the issue of dealing with a post-election Iran to see which of the elements within society are the ones that will take over in a post-Rouhani regime.
Thank you, Mark. Certainly, I think a focus from the return of a potential JCPOA is definitely a topic that we are going to be watching very closely with the Biden administration. Now, Ambassador, we touched on this very briefly in your last comments, but I think it's difficult to ignore the potential influence of Russia. What is going to be the potential Biden administration strategy when it comes to Russia? Is this going to be one of the top concerns when it comes to security, both national security, but also international security when it comes to this actor?
Well, thanks, Savannah. Obviously the incoming administration will have a lot of challenges to focus on, above all, of course, the issues here at home and globally. Issues related to the relationship with China will likely loom large. But there's no question that when it comes to Russia, the new administration will be inheriting significant challenges in the relationship with Russia, including issues regarding Ukraine, sanctions, which have continued to evolve under the current administration, diplomatic expulsions and consulate closures, some of which had occurred during the Obama administration, and concerns related to such issues as European energy security. I'm referring specifically to Nord Stream 2 and Turk Stream and so on. Perhaps looming most urgently, and Mark may have comments on this as well, will be the question of the extension of New START and our arms control agreements. It's also important, I think, to note that Putin's current term ends in 2024, but with the constitutional referendum that passed overwhelmingly earlier this year, he could well be in office until 2036. So as a result, the incoming Biden administration and even future US presidents will most likely need to be dealing with President Putin for years to come. So I would anticipate, though, however, again, given the extensive experience of this national security team, that the new administration will likely take a very realistic look at the relationship with Russia to identify areas where it is in the U.S. interest to perhaps engage. I mentioned arms control above all, but also to manage the differences that are out there. I think we can anticipate a more consistent U.S. policy towards Russia within the administration itself, which has not always been the case currently with President-elect Biden, his national security team, and I would anticipate too Congress pretty well aligned on issues related to sanctions and other issues in the relationship with Russia. We'll see with Tony Blinken moving to the State Department, I think a greater role for professional diplomats in working on the relationship, which could lead to the resumption of some working level channels with Russia. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, I think we'll see again a close US-EU transatlantic relationship and level of cooperation with regard to approaches towards Russia. As I mentioned, I think the top priority will be the extension of New START because it expires on February 5th. So that gives the new administration just a matter of just a couple of weeks really to work on getting that extended. The agreement can be extended for up to 5 years, and even on a shorter basis, perhaps a year extension, which has been signaled, as I understand, by both sides already. This could lead to more discussions on other related arms control issues. As I mentioned, sanctions will definitely remain an issue. Many of the viewers may be aware that the additional sanctions related to Nord Stream 2 may well be passed before the end of the year in connection with the National Defense Authorization Act, which may make it impossible to complete Nord Stream 2, at least in the near term, and have implications not only for Russia, but for our relations with Germany, where it's been quite a sticking point. There are some potential areas of cooperation, issues perhaps related to, public health, the global pandemic related issues. Space cooperation has been an area where we've, despite ups and downs, continued to work with Russia. Perhaps even issues related to climate change and the Arctic, where we obviously both have interest, but there are plenty of difficult areas as well, which again, everyone's quite familiar with, ranging from cyber threats, election interference issues, US approaches on democracy promotion and human rights. And President-elect Biden's made clear his plans for a global community of democracies meeting, which is probably not gone unnoticed. I think bottom line is that I would anticipate a more sort of business-like, clear-eyed approach to our diplomatic relations with Russia. As I said, holding Russia accountable when necessary. Working on the differences and the issues that we have, though perhaps also looking at cooperating when it is in our interests, even if some of those bilateral areas for cooperation may be limited.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I want to take a moment to remind our audience members, I've seen quite a few questions coming in the chat. Please keep adding them in so we can make sure that we make time at the end for all these questions. Now, Ozgur, I want to turn to you because we've kind of gone a little bit in the weeds with the various theaters that we're focusing on, potential guesses and predictions for the incoming new administration. But I want to take a bigger picture here and overarching themes. What do you think are the biggest challenges that NATO is going to face in the new year? Obviously, COVID-19 has presented international challenges for everyone around the world. So will this be the biggest focus that will need to be tackled, or will this be something that will kind of accompany other major issues and challenges?
Thank you, Savannah. Well, I mean, apparently, if we're bringing COVID-19 into the picture, probably no challenge is as important or is even comparable to COVID-19, but I'm not sure that is the main focus of NATO at this point. I would look at it two ways, inside out and outside in. Probably definitely the biggest challenge for NATO at this point is how to contain Russian aggression. That has been the ongoing challenge for NATO lately. But one reason NATO, well, I mean, of course, it's not, there is certain success in this front, but if the success is not as big as we would like it to be, the reason is, of course, creating harmony and unity. The challenge of creating harmony and unity within NATO, the transatlantic rift, but also, let's say, the discussion on European strategic autonomy, not the concept per se, but the way the discussion continues. Also, we should note that although under President Trump there was this discourse about the pivot away from Europe, the American footprint in Europe has actually not decreased under President Trump. But although it did not decrease, the American commitment to Europe has become questionable for Europeans, and I don't think that this is changing. So it's a longer-term view for the Europeans. And I don't think that Biden's presidency is going to automatically change this. So this will be an important challenge for President Biden. And then, of course, there are all sorts of divisions within NATO, such as, East and West, North and South. If we take the question of Turkey, maybe because we are discussing Turkey, for example, Turkey is still concerned that NATO doesn't take its security concerns into question. We saw how this was manifested during the Warsaw summit. I think Turkey will continue to manifest its dissatisfaction on this front.
Certainly. Well, and I want to press you a little bit more on this topic with the challenges facing NATO, because I think this is something that has spanned multiple administrations. The question of burden sharing, the commitment to the transatlantic alliance. Obviously, we've heard comments of NATO being brain dead. So how do we approach this collective defense alliance in terms of sort of a revitalization, if you will, of NATO? Because you present specific concerns, obviously Turkey's security concerns. So how might this alliance mitigate this with a new administration coming in?
Well, I mean, it goes both ways. First of all, including my own country, European allies need to upgrade their contributions, first of all, and they need to increase their military spending in ways that are actually useful for NATO. But also the United States should understand that every country has a different security culture, it has a different culture, and every country is under a different economic situation. So like a country that currently has a large current account surplus cannot be expected to act the same way with a country that has a current account deficit. Or like countries, well, let's take the case of Turkey. Turkey is in a region that is very volatile, so it makes sense for Turkey to actually have a big army, and the Turkish society actually accepts spending a large chunk of the budget for military purposes because of the security situation the country is in. But if you're somewhere at the center of Europe without any visible enemies over the horizon, then the society's outlook to these issues will be very different. And then the United States should also understand that military spending and spending for security are not the same things. For example, the transportation infrastructure that Germany is building, which is very advanced, could be actually very useful in a large-scale war for NATO's operations in Europe. So such contributions, let's say soft security spendings, should also be considered. But more important than all of this, I think we should all be honest and sincere. And let me explain what I mean with one example. After September 11, not only NATO allies, like most countries in the world, decided to establish a united front against terrorism. We said no longer should it be the case that someone's terrorist should be another's freedom fighter. And for a while, it seemed to work. This is not the situation any longer. So Turkey works with some, let's say, gray zone organizations in Syria. Turkey's support to Hamas is highly questionable. And the United States sees no problem in cooperating with a terrorist organization to counter another one in Syria. So I think we should all walk the walk if we're talking the talk as well. So on all of these issues, we should be very frank and sincere and honest and set standards and abide by the standards that we're setting.
Thank you, Ozgur. And I think it's important to note, for audience members who aren't aware, obviously Article 5 is this sort of collective defense measure that was used for the first time following the September 11th, 2001 attacks here in the States. Now, Mary, I want to, if you will, turn to a quick audience question, actually, because I think it kind of follows up nicely with what we had just discussed in terms of Russia. Again, for a little bit of the background, the New START treaty between the US, Russia, it's the measures for the further reduction and the limitation of the strategic offensive arms, New START treaty. And we've discussed this a little bit. So an audience member asked if a new treaty or extension of the New START treaty does not occur in the new year, kind of the worst case scenario, I guess, how would this affect relations moving forward?
Well, I think we all very much hope, given what we've been hearing from, the Russian side as well as from the incoming administration, that they will be successful in the first instance, at least, extending the New START treaty by 1 year. And if that's the case, it then provides a period of time for both sides and the new administration in particular to really explore, next steps, how to perhaps further build on the New START treaty and to, just as importantly, re-engage in additional arms control discussions on other issues. Your audience members are undoubtedly aware that the Trump administration had pulled out of the INF treaty previously and most recently left the Open Skies Treaty. And I think it's important to, look at these issues not only in terms of the impact on the bilateral relationship, but really on the sort of kind of broader, in terms of broader global security interests as well. So I don't necessarily want to play out the worst case scenario that perhaps your audience member is getting at, but I do think it's very much front and center in terms of the incoming administration's understanding of issues that will need to be tackled really on day one.
Certainly. Thank you, Ambassador. And I think a big overarching theme that we've seen from all the panelists is kind of this lean on institutional diplomacy, and obviously the past record from many of those tapped thus far to join the pending new administration. So we will certainly hope for a better positive outcome and not the worst case scenario, but thank you for addressing that potential would-be scenario. Ozgur, another audience question. I mean, we have many questions to get to, so I kind of want to weave them into our conversation. This is something that we have discussed briefly with the issue of Cyprus. This question comes from an audience member suggesting UN-sponsored negotiations for a settlement has been continuing, obviously, for years without much success, and talks a lot about Biden's potential lean towards a more Greek view. Do you think this may make any problems worse in Cyprus, or will this kind of overarching theme we've discussed of diplomacy first and negotiations continue to address this issue?
Thank you, Savannah. First of all, I think it will be great if the Biden administration re-engages in Cyprus. I think it will be one of the best news that we will be receiving, because given that Republic of Cyprus is a member of the EU, neither the European Union nor individual EU member states can actually play the role of an intermediary or driver of negotiations between the two countries. And since the United States exited the scene, we have not seen any serious development on Cyprus, and the Trans-Montana round of talks were a big source of dissatisfaction, frustration for Turkey, that has led to Turkey's current policy of, let's say, entertaining the idea of a two-state solution and leaning towards a confederal solution rather than a federal solution. First of all, it would be a great news if President Biden decided to appoint a Cyprus envoy. That would be a very important message to both sides. And although, of course, President Biden may have past pro-Greek leanings, if he is engaging the Cyprus problem as the President of the United States, his priority would be to become successful, which would require that he takes a neutral stance. Now, we also need to be realistic, of course. There have been several rounds of negotiations between the two communities on the island without much success. The closest we came was in 2002 under the Annan plan. So even if the negotiations don't lead to immediate settlement, I think that being at the negotiating table is better than not negotiating at all, because in the absence of negotiations, Turkey will go in the direction that President Erdogan says Turkey will go in the direction. So I think it's very important that one of the first things when President Biden sits in his office will be to appoint a Cyprus envoy and invite both parties to negotiations. And also, Savannah, let me also make one thing very clear. There is actually unanimity on this issue, on the side. To a certain level, Turkey is pretty united about the Cyprus issue on three principles. That there should be a bi-communal, bi-zonal settlement in Cyprus based on the principle of political equality of the Turks and Greeks on the island. So long as these three principles are abided by, I believe that even President Erdogan will be indifferent to whether it's a two-state solution, a confederal settlement, or a federal settlement. On the other hand, in the Trans-Montana round of talks, we saw that the Greek Cypriots were not ready to accept the political equality of the Turks on the island. If President Biden, President-elect Biden, if his administration could persuade the Greeks to accept the political equality of Turks and Greeks on the island, that would be a huge step forward.
Thank you, Ozgur. Obviously, these are complicated issues that we could have a whole panel separately on each one. So I understand that we are doing our best to cover a wide array of topics that influence and impact the transatlantic relations. Ambassador, we've talked a bit about the threats to NATO, especially as it relates to an area you're very familiar with, whether it be Eurasian theater. And we've seen competition heating up within the Southeastern European area between a number of players, but one we haven't really discussed too much of, and that's China. China. How can the US within NATO or transatlantic partnerships counter this Chinese influence in the region?
Well, thank you, Savannah. I think, you know, it's important to really start by recognizing, you know, the scope of the challenge. And I know we've already talked a fair bit about Russia, but, you know, I think both the Russian and the Chinese emerging influence in the region, and the Balkans region and Southeast Europe more generally, but in the Balkans in particular, is worthy of close attention for a number of reasons. I think the sort of reduced focus by the US and the EU, reduced attention to the region, has in some ways opened the door to increased activity by both countries. And it's not only in the economic area, and certainly China has been most active in terms of significant investments in the Balkans, but also in the case of Russia in you know, far broader fields: security, military, intelligence, energy, and other fields of activity. In the case of China in particular, China has provided financing for a number of major infrastructure projects, which are seen as very welcome in the Balkans, but they do, and they have carried with them significant debt that the countries have now taken on, and raised questions about the ability to repay those debts. So what can be done? I think a really important step that needs to be taken is to you know, accelerate progress on Euro-Atlantic integration in the region. It's, you know, really the unfinished business of European integration lies in the Balkans. And while there's, you know, a certain amount of you know, accession fatigue in Europe itself, and you know, diminishing optimism about in countries in the region about where this is going to go, I mean, I do think it's important that that the engagement be intensified, and this will require, and this is important in the context of sort of dealing with our Chinese and Russian engagement in the region as well, to really focus on issues related to democracy, economic reform, rule of law, and good governance that can build the kind of resiliency to the corruption and you know, investments that capture key industries and that can become problematic as a result of some of the investment that we're seeing. Also important, and this applies more to the case of Russian disinformation, is improving the ability to respond to by you know, journalists, independent media, civil society itself, to respond to disinformation. And also provide technical assistance to improve cyber defenses. And and in the case of Russia, it is looking also to ways in which you know, linkages to Europe and throughout the region, including in the infrastructure areas, can be strengthened. As well as, and this is, I think, a very important point, ensuring that there is stronger energy diversification, reduced energy dependency on Russia, which again creates, you know, more resilience and helps to strengthen the countries in the way that they're balancing relationships with these other countries.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now, Mark, not to put you in the hot seat as you jump back in here with us, but there are a few different points that I'd love to address with you. And Ambassador Mary Warlick just touched on this a little bit with the idea of disinformation. One of the audience questions was, you know, how can the U.S. really contend with the disinformation, malign foreign influence that's stemming so often from countries like Russia and Iran? And if I can tack in another audience question here as well, we've got a few questions related to the CAATSA sanctions. So is there, you know, this imminent risk with a Biden administration coming into play that this will kind of be the first move with CAATSA sanctions, or is this going to be diplomacy first? Let's see if we can discuss and then see what happens.
Well, on the second part, I think you can characterize all new administrations coming in as that visual you have of Lavrov and Hillary Clinton holding the reset button. I think all relations will want to start with the diplomatic outreach to see how serious the host country, in the case of the ambassadors, will want to engage with the United States. So I think the first outreach will be one of diplomacy, and then we'll go from there. However, with regards to the CAATSA sanctions, a lot of that authority resides in the United States Congress. So I think that will have to come into play as well. In terms of disinformation, I think that the Americans are seeing through a lot of the disinformation that's coming from abroad, because they've had so much experience with disinformation that we've created ourselves on our own social networks. So hopefully we'll become a little more formal on how we confront the disinformation, particularly some of the reforms that have been made by Twitter and Facebook, so on and so forth. But over the past 40 years, I think we've all seen what disinformation can do internal to our own country, and I hope we'll, since I'm hoping that we will only have to worry about external sources of disinformation from this point forward, we'll focus more on that than we will as we've had to over the last 4 years.
Certainly, and I think you make a key point in both of these issues. One, the idea of the role of U.S. Congress. Obviously, we haven't talked too much about this because there is such a buzz with a new change of administration, obviously. And secondly, this disinformation is not only external, but internal as well. And hopefully we can mitigate that soon. Ozgur, I want to put you on the spot a little bit. Obviously, you can't speak for Turkey, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on an audience question here, asking whether or not Turkey would support Bosnia as a NATO ally with the incoming potential change. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, Turkey champions Bosnia's NATO accession, not only supports. So there is no doubt that Turkey will support Bosnia's NATO membership.
Certainly, great. And if you could just elaborate as well on, the challenges that Turkey is facing. Obviously, you've mentioned, and we all know if audience members are paying attention to this, the championing of this change. But Turkey faces its own, difficulties within NATO, as we've touched on with the S-400 issue. So is that going to be a continued thorn, or is this going to be something that we address swiftly, as Mark mentioned, with CAATSA sanctions coming soon?
Savannah, it's not only the S-400s, of course. I mean,
yes.
so first of all, I mean, let me put it this way. President Erdogan is not popular in any NATO country, first of all. That's a problem that has been ongoing. Second, well, I mean, Turkey has different problems, different challenges with different NATO allies. And I'm not even vaguely implying that Turkey is on the wrong side of any of these discussions, but Turkey has conflicts with Greece, Turkey has conflicts with France. It has been engaging in an undiplomatic way of foreign policy, using its military at the forefront, even when it comes to NATO allies. So none of these things actually look good or make Turkey appear good. Or, some of Turkey's incursions into Syria were widely opposed within the NATO. And of course, NATO is an alliance of democratic countries, and therefore the quality of democracy in Turkey is not irrelevant for other NATO allies. And I do not see any of these problems just going away anytime soon. On the other hand, there's another reality, which is that Turkey needs NATO, and that Turkey is a great asset for NATO. So I think that in all of these challenges, both other NATO allies and Turkey will need to remain patient and to keep the flame alive and hope that these problems will be resolved over the long run. There is another evolving problem, an emerging problem, which is a zero-sum mentality of some NATO allies. When it comes to Turkey, there is this mentality that if something is good for Turkey, it must be bad for NATO. So I don't believe that it's, there's no reason why it should be so. For example, Turkey's operation in Libya is open to criticism, obviously. On the other hand, like the argument that Turkey is undermining the interests of NATO with its operation in Libya is totally baseless because what Turkey did in Libya, in a right way or wrong way, that's another argument, but it was to contain Russian extension towards Western Mediterranean. How is this against NATO's interests. I mean, Libya is just a few hundred kilometers from Naples, where there is a NATO base. So would it be better if Russia was controlling the area? Obviously not. So, you know, these are, of course, huge issues, but I'm afraid all of these problems will remain with us in the foreseeable future.
Certainly. Thank you for touching a little bit more on that. Unfortunately, I'm looking at the time and we are cutting it a bit short. So I just want to open it to our panelists for any last thoughts or comments, words. Mark, if you don't mind, I'm going to put you on the spot again. If you have any ending thoughts to share with our panelists and audience members before we sign off here today.
Yeah, I just, sorry, I dropped my glasses. I think on the issue of the transatlantic relationship, my sensing, and I think everybody realizes that we're trying to get back in. We're trying to reestablish not only our membership, but our leadership inside of NATO. But I don't think it's going to be as easy. I think we've bruised some relationship over the last 4 years. And I think the situation has changed considerably during that time. My second comment is on the bilateral relationship with Turkey. As I said, I think we're going to try diplomacy first. It will be interesting to see who the Biden administration appoints as the U.S. ambassador, both in Turkey and in Greece, for that matter, and who the U.S. ambassador to NATO will be. Earlier, it was said that the relationship is in a crisis. We've had worse crises in our relationship with NATO members. I remain optimistic that we can resolve, or at least put on ice some of these long-standing or near-standing challenges we've had. I think we can get somewhere with the S-400. I think we can get somewhere with a couple of the other minor issues. I don't think we're going to get anywhere with the Gulen issues simply because that's a matter for the courts and the judicial system, and it can't be affected by the executive branch. So while we will try to work the situation, I was stunned or saddened when I was last in Istanbul a couple of weeks ago that there were such proclamations coming out with regards to the 37th anniversary of the Cyprus operation. And of course, the Nagorno-Karabakh situation is to some extent aggravating that relationship. But I think we'll be better off in a year from now than we are now. I certainly hope so. Because as I used to say as a young officer serving at NATO, the only thing worse than NATO is no NATO.
Thank you so much. And Ambassador Warlick, I'd love to turn to you. Any last thoughts or comments before we close out our session today?
Well, thank you very much, Savannah, and thanks for the opportunity to participate in the conversation today. So I'd echo a lot of what Mark just said, but I'd add a couple of things. I think there's very good reason to be quite optimistic, very optimistic about the new national security team and new foreign policy leadership that an incoming Biden administration, including on the part of the president-elect, will be bringing to the table. And I think a new beginning, a new fresh look at all of our relationships across Eurasia will be clearly very welcome. That said, Mark's absolutely right in saying, you know, the geopolitics have shifted over the last years. Nagorno-Karabakh is a good example, right, where the Russians have entrenched themselves now, not only in playing a critical role in the ceasefire, but with troops on the ground now. And yes, there is going to be rebuilding that needs to be done in terms of the transatlantic relationship. We can't assume that it will necessarily be easy to return to the table and say that America is back and now in charge again. There's a lot of trust that needs to be rebuilt. But I think as I said, I think there is a great deal of goodwill, of experience and expertise that's going to be brought to the table in tackling these issues in a realistic way, together with our European allies, being clear-eyed about pursuing U.S. interests, supporting democracies and democratic processes and being straightforward in our discussions with countries across the region, even as we play a really critical role, it seems to me, in terms of working towards greater Euro-Atlantic, stronger Euro-Atlantic integration and restoring our relationships across Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And last but not least, Ozgur, if you have any last thoughts before we close out our session today.
Two thoughts. First of all, on the U.S. ambassador to Turkey. If there wasn't an ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Turkey, I would still suggest appointing Ambassador Satterfield, the sitting ambassador, who is really doing a great job. Like, I would rather see him ambassador of the United States for a decade to come. But of course, ambassadors need to be changed every now and then. There's a question on how to fix the relationship. So my short answer to this is this: we should change the way we think about U.S.-Turkey relationship. We always think that there was once a golden age that can be revived. It's not true. There never was a golden age in U.S.-Turkey relationship. But the reality is actually we are not in the age of strategic relationships anymore. This is the age of transactionalism. And I don't think that transactionalism is subject to only President Trump in the United States. So I guess we will see more of this in the future as well. So I think Turkey and the United States should do the following. We should divide the issues that we have into three. There are issues that we agree on, or our national interests. We think our national interests are the same. Well, we should cooperate on those issues, maybe transactionally. Second, there is a bunch of issues. There's actually a bigger number of issues on which we currently disagree, but which actually we could reach a consensus on if either or both of the parties made minor adjustments to their approaches. So we should work on these issues to turn them into issues that we agree on. Then there is a third bucket of smaller number of issues that are toxic. These are issues that we likely will not agree in the foreseeable future. On these, we usually say we should agree to disagree, but agreeing to disagree is not enough. We should also build firewalls around these issues so that they don't burn down the whole relationship. I mean, to take one example, so Turkey will fight the PKK and its denominations wherever it finds it, without any regard of geography. And the United States wants to be in a position to be able to cooperate with Kurdish groups in the Middle East to the extent that it is possible. So these two policies are actually, and I don't think that either side is changing its policy in the foreseeable future, which means that we will keep bumping into each other. And to avoid bumping into each other, we should have a conversation on not agreeing on the issue, but actually setting limits to what each of the actors, let's say, can do in pursuit of these policies. And I actually see Turkey and the United States already trying to do this in Syria, for example. If we do this, if we lower our expectations that we either agree on everything or we disagree on everything, actually things could be a lot smoother.
Thank you, Ozgur. And Mark, you wanted to make one more quick comment before we close out, so I'll turn the floor to you.
Yeah, I would just simply advise the Biden team and NATO, for that matter, to think about our return to NATO the way that we've trained our troops as they come back from a long deployment, and their families. We've been gone for a while. There's a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of high expectations about our return. There will be a honeymoon period of a couple of weeks when we get home. But after that, we've got to get back to the hard business and the reality of the problems that we had before we left. And now we have to deal with them now that the honeymoon period is over.
I think that's a great way to close out our session. Thank you all so much for our panelists. Certainly the hard work is ahead of us all. And I think that through dialogue, just like we had today, we will be able to focus more on the importance of returning to a re-energized transatlantic relationship. And I'm very impressed with our panelists. One of our audience members said they were grateful for persuasive and experts like yourselves, and I myself feel the same. So thank you to our incredible panelists. Thank you to our audience for tuning in today. Again, this conversation is going to be live on our website very soon at www.turkheritage.org. Thank you all. Take care and stay safe.
Thank you, Savannah.